Thank you all for coming this evening, and it's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Phoebe Armanios. I am Associate Professor of History and Director of Middle East Studies. And before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to thank all the multiple co-sponsors for this event: the Middle East Studies Program, the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs, the Academic Enrichment Funds, the Arabic Enrichment Funds, the Pardon Tillinghast Endowment Funds, Departments of Classics, French, History, and Italian, the programs in Environmental Studies and European Studies. All came together for this event. And Cook Commons, last but not least. Thank you, Cook Commons. The fact that so many people came together for organizing this talk shows the increased centrality and relevance of food studies on our campus, which is very exciting indeed. I would also like to announce preemptively that following our lecture this evening, should you choose to do so, Clifford will be happy to sign your cookbook if you own a copy of any of his books. It would be quite difficult to relay our speaker's rich and prolific accomplishments in just a couple of minutes, but I'll try hard to give you a brief glimpse. Clifford A. Wright is a widely recognized food writer, cook, and research scholar specializing in the cuisines of the Mediterranean. Wright received his MA in philosophy from the New School for Social Research in New York, was a doctoral candidate in philosophy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Before embarking on a new career in culinary research and food writing, he worked as a researcher at the esteemed Brookings Institute and as a fellow at the Institute of Arab Studies, as well as executive director of the American Middle East Peace Research Institute. We are all grateful, however, that his career took a different turn. At the start of his new career, Clifford was chosen as one of the most innovative cooks in America by the New York Times in its Cooks on the Map series, recognized for his style of emphasizing regional Mediterranean home cooking with its historical background. Today, he is the author of 16 books, 14 of which are cookbooks. These include A Mediterranean Feast, winner of the James Beard KitchenAid Cookbook of the Year and Best Writing on Food Awards, and his most recent offering, One Pot Wonders, which is just hot off the presses. Incidentally, the James Beard Awards are the highest honor for food and beverage professionals working in North America. Wright's works have received numerous accolades. In his review of Wright's book, A Mediterranean Feast, Juan Rodriguez of the Montreal Gazette wrote, quote, that in a surprisingly seamless style, Wright wears the hats of academic, historian, scientist, traveler, chef, and food lover. He makes the past come alive on one page, then on the next brings you to a modern-day kitchen in, say, Egypt or Sicily, side by side with a home cook whose recipe was passed on through generations of history's tumult. Recently, I should add, Clifford has been keeping busier than ever. Since 2009, he has been regularly co-teaching cooking courses along with notable food writer Martha Rose Shulman in Los Angeles, California. I'd also like to shout out to my History 352 class who really inspired me this semester to use Clifford's book and to really think creatively about food in the Middle East and the Mediterranean world. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest today, Clifford Wright.
I want to thank Professor Armanios for inviting me and for all of you coming tonight. And when you have an introduction like that, you're really set up for nothing but failure. So I'll do my best to fulfill that fabulous introduction, the whole time of which I'm thinking, who is she talking about? I think of myself as a cook and a writer. And all these various accolades just confuse me because my approach to cooking is really very simple. I'm often asked as a food writer about my favorite restaurant. And I said, well, actually, I'm not a restaurant critic. I write about home cooking, and in particular home cooking in the Mediterranean. And one of the interesting things or interesting approaches that I have to this particular field began as a hobby, where I was looking at how particular dishes that are well known came to be and realized that food has a history and that that's pretty cool. But little did I realize that food is also an entry into history. And it's a great way to tell a story where otherwise you might lose someone who is not interested. Food interests everybody because in the end you can eat it, which is kind of cool. So the title of my lecture tonight is The Role of the Arabs in the Formation of Mediterranean Gastronomy. And I need to point out first that one of the problems I have about talking about food is exactly how to pitch a talk, especially about food, because food as a topic draws all kinds of people. And it draws scholars and it draws cooks. And sometimes they're the same thing, but sometimes they're not. So what I'm going to get into tonight is with quite a bit of depth. And I will be monitoring your faces. And the moment I see a nod, you will see me tacked with the wind. So one of the interesting things about, I've been asked a number of times today, why were you interested in Mediterranean as opposed to somewhere else? And there's a variety of reasons. That's not as important as how we think about the Mediterranean. And one of the typical approaches to Mediterranean thinking is Roman ruins, Crusader castles, magnificent Renaissance buildings, seaside villages with bougainvillea tumbling down. And we think of the Mediterranean as this unitary thing, this one thing called the Mediterranean. And this is particularly true in the world of food. So one argument goes, this unitary Mediterranean has a continuous history from the time of the Greeks to today. And that's sort of a received wisdom in food writing. And it occurred to me that that probably isn't true. And I tried to identify why that might not be true. And I focused on three elements which I think actually make it untrue. And the first will be the topic of tonight's talk, which is the rise of Islam and the Arab agricultural revolution, which is approximately the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. The second is the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which I will just briefly go over. And the last is the age of discovery and the discovery of the New World and the foods that came from the New World. But the key thing here are these agricultural introductions from the Muslim world. And the important thing to remember here is we carry with us a lot of baggage about what the Mediterranean is, who the Arabs are, and it was really a different world. And one of the ways to look at that world is to, I think, look at Sicily and Spain as two great examples of where three great cultures, based on three great religions, actually intersected for a long period of time. And I hate to use the word lived in harmony, but for the times, that was about as harmonious as it was going to get, which is pretty harmonious, given that they lived together and didn't kill each other for long periods of time. Tough way to look at it. So we know the Mediterranean is composed of all these different cultures. So what is exactly Mediterranean cuisine? So here's what we share with Mediterranean cuisine. There's olive oil, the Trinity, olive oil, wheat, and the vine. But Italian food is a world apart from Egyptian food. And there's a confusion about this Mediterranean food. And here's the interesting concept. Only an American would cook Mediterranean food. Mediterranean food doesn't exist. And if you say, and I've said to a Sicilian, to an Egyptian, to a Greek, tell me about Mediterranean food, just scratch your head. I don't know anything about Mediterranean food, but I can tell you something about Greek food. And that's kind of a key idea here, is that this concept of Mediterranean food, or it could be Mediterranean diet, is almost like a constellation that we create, a construct that we create in order to understand a bigger thing that needs explaining. And that's what Mediterranean cuisine is. And it's entirely different than the world of the Mediterranean during classical times. And it's quite startling to realize, too, that at the time of Plato, when a Greek cook was cooking, they had no oranges, no lemons, no rice, no sugar, no spinach, no eggplant. All of those were still to come from Asia. There were no potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn, no green beans, no zucchini, no chili. They had yet to come from the New World. There was no watermelon, and there was no bananas, and there was no coffee. All of that had yet to come from Africa. Think about what's left. It doesn't resemble contemporary Mediterranean food at all. And I believe that this Mediterranean food evolved over time from these three great revolutions that I mentioned. The first being an advanced Islamic society, which brought its then state-of-the-art science and agronomy in the early part of the millennium, brought these foods to the West through the initial Islam and subsequent Islamic invasions of North Africa and parts of Southern Europe, particularly Spain and Sicily, the two most important places. This was then influenced by the transition of feudalism to capitalism and the growth of wealth, and helping with the discovery of the New World after 1492 and the foods introduced. And all of it kind of revolving around the aesthetic ideals of the Renaissance, which is where the newly wealthy bourgeoisie were enjoying themselves. So with the rise of Islamic civilization, you have a preserving of Hellenistic tradition, which was transmitting at the same time ideas that were Jewish, Persian, Indian, Chinese, scientific heritage, translation, mathematical heritage, and so forth. And the role of agriculture, though, is important because to understand agriculture means to understand cuisine, not only because it provided food, but it actually created the foundation for the emergence of capitalism, because capitalism and the creation of wealth was rooted in the profits that were made from trade, and the overwhelming trade was in the products of agriculture, namely two most important, grain and spices. The wealth of Venice is based on spices. So once wealth was created through the accumulation of capital, and you have these new class of entrepreneurs emerging for the first time ever, and cities grew, and with it, refinements of life grew. A thing called good living came to be, as people wanted to live better. Now keep in mind, we're only talking about the upper echelons of society, maybe 1 or 2% of the population. All of the extant cookbooks were written for that 1 or 2%. The rest of humanity remains in the shadows. Those people were illiterate, succumbed to starvation and famine and war, and we don't know much about their cookery, except that it was sustenance level and famine level. So the cuisine that emerged was, of course, not widespread, and it became more widespread as wealth was created. And two of the most important areas in which the Arabic scientific endeavor were important was in the area of agriculture and hydrology. There was a virtual agricultural revolution, which the economic historian Andrew Watson called a medieval green revolution. And it's paramount of importance to understand this, to understand the evolution of modern European cuisine. So Arab agronomists learned many of their techniques from the Romans, but they were far more sophisticated in how these techniques were applied in their understanding of agriculture. They studied the structure and the temperature of moisture of soils, and the result that the Arab farmer could begin to predict yields and crops. In Roman and as well as Byzantine Sicily, the land was cropped once every 2 years, and the Arabs cropped 4 times during the same period. So they freed up more land for cultivation, and they created, in essence, a new growing season. Arab technical innovations led not only to a revolution in agriculture, but to an economic revolution as well, because of all the changes in the lives of people. These innovations in hydrology and irrigation meant that the peasant, by controlling water flow, controlled the number of times that they could harvest. So the crippling famines and the crushing poverty of the early medieval period were checked, and as the economy grew, more food became available. So an enormous number of new crops were discovered or diffused by the Arabs, and they play a central role in this more productive agriculture, which is linked to the economy at large. So they had higher yielding crops of older plants that were already existing, like cabbage, and there is an increasing productivity of land and labor. And the most important of these foods diffused in the Mediterranean by the Arabs, and almost all of them are coming from further east, from China, India, the Malay Peninsula. Some are coming from the savanna of Africa. And I'm going to just list some of the foods that I'll touch upon. And the most important I'll talk about at the end and why it's the most important. So sorghum, rice, durum wheat, sugarcane, a variety of citrus fruits such as bitter orange, lemon, and lime, bananas, plantains, the coconut palm, watermelon, mangoes, and vegetables such as spinach, artichoke, taro, and eggplant, all being brought to the Mediterranean. Land use under the Arabs, and remember, if you're looking at this map, the Arabs are essentially controlling. So they burst out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, and they head north, and pretty soon they're controlling all of the Levant, all of North Africa. In the 8th century, they jump across Spain. By the 10th century, they're controlling Sicily, all of Spain, and are raiding throughout the Mediterranean. So they're basically everywhere. At that time, the Turks have not yet moved into Turkey. They're still nomadic tribes further east, and Turkey is essentially Greek, Byzantine Greek. So with this specialization of land use and irrigation technology, crop rotation, all of this is improving and making farming more labor intensive. And as a result, the whole economy is improving. There's a growth of trade, an enlargement of the money economy, a rise in population, and increasing urbanization and more food being produced as agricultural workers and agricultural technology is now more efficient. Now, one of the reasons that Arabs are not usually associated with agriculture is because of a couple things. One, we think of Arabs as desert dwellers, when in fact most Arabs were urban. And we don't think of them as farmers. In fact, many of them were farmers. Only the Bedouin rode around in camels, and they weren't the majority. So another issue, too, is exactly how an Islamic system of land tenure encouraged productive agriculture. When the Arabs came into, let's take Sicily as an example because it's a crossroads of the Mediterranean, they broke up the existing Roman and Byzantine estates that were known as latifundia, and they were huge, quite unproductive estates. They were broken up into smaller productive farms, and these estates were often broken down as a result of Islamic law concerning partition of property upon inheritance, and they became more efficient and produced more food. So around the Mediterranean, where the Arabs were, there were lots of small farms, gardens, orchards, and the owner of the small farm is more likely to innovate when he knows he's feeding his family as opposed to feeding the wealth of the landlord. And in the medieval Arab world, these remaining large estates, most of the agricultural workers were free from many of the oppressive features that were prevalent under the Romans and Byzantines. And there was no domain, which is manorial land worked with involuntary tenant labor. And as a result, they're more productive and agricultural innovation could occur. So this medieval green revolution has sometimes been described by food writers as a result of the Crusaders and not of Arab agricultural ingenuity. We do know, and it's interesting, all you have to do is read Runciman to get this idea, who's the great historian of the Crusades. The Crusaders really contributed just about nothing. In fact, they're in Jerusalem, I believe in the 12th century, there was a street where the Crusaders were sort of heavily prevalent, and it was known as the Street of Bad Cooking. Which is kind of one of my favorite Crusader stories. The only thing, according to Runciman, the only thing that the Crusaders contributed were possibly balsam, and that's about it, which is used in liturgical ceremonies and so forth. So now you have this new agricultural season opened up, and the Arabs are bringing these interesting crops coming mostly from subtropical areas. Now, there was conditions of great heat in the Mediterranean, but there's also great cold and there's lack of water. And the ingenuity was irrigation systems which allowed cold weather crops such as spinach to be grown in the Mediterranean. That was a true advance. And although it wasn't known at the time, spinach is a very nutritious vegetable. Although the Arabs were responsible for this agricultural revolution, it should be understood that Islamic civilization at the time was a perplexing tangle of many different cultures, which is in fact the story of the Mediterranean. It's a story of complex cultures constantly interacting with one another. Even to this day, with all of the troubles that you find in the Mediterranean, economic, political, and so forth, it's still a world of people interacting with each other, people living in close proximity to each other and having to deal with each other, which is why what's happening today, let's say in Syria, is so horribly depressing. It's happening for one reason: fear. Everyone is scared of everyone else. And that's not the topic of my talk, but the fact that everyone lives so close, in such close proximity, and lived peacefully for many years, and then degenerates suddenly into sectarian warfare, and then peace returns. But that's kind of the history of the Mediterranean. So I have never kind of accepted the notion that there was a Roman and Greek classical tradition that was continuous. You've got to look at the Arab contribution to European culture, tempered, mind you, by the learning of Jews, Persians, Chinese, and Indians. And in the area of agricultural expertise, there's texts, of course, but remember that most practical knowledge is passed by ordinary farmers in ways that are taught to sons on how to farm, because they were unlettered people and they left no records. Now, this significance of Islamic civilization in the Mediterranean has led several scholars to suggest three important conclusions, which I'd like to mention, although I don't necessarily accept them wholeheartedly, but they're interesting to think about. First is that the advanced civilization of the Arabs contributed to the enrichment of Western Europe mainly in two areas: the improvement of the material basis of society and the refinement of life. Second, that the Europeans of the early medieval period were, for the most part, backward, ignorant, and illiterate, and had little awareness of the technology, agronomy, fashion, and gastronomy, and the other elements of good living that they were adopting were in fact Arab and Islamic in character. And lastly, and this is probably the most controversial point, but it's a fascinating one, there's several books on it, is that Arabic literature, which was beginning to be translated around the 11th century, 12th century, had wonderful descriptions of gracious good living, and that may have stimulated the imagination of Europe and sparked the poetic genius of the Romance people. And one author often pointed to, for you Italophiles in the room, is Dante, and the examples of Islamic influence in Dante. I'm getting off topic here, then let's get back to food. So whatever judgment about those conclusion, it's clear that the rise of feudalism and the transition to capitalism in the European Mediterranean needs to be thought of in terms of being influenced by Islamic civilization. So of the foods I had mentioned earlier, I'm going to go through them one at a time, but then I'm going to speak in some depth about hard wheat. So the first food was sorghum, which is the world's fifth most important grain, and it's used to make couscous or bread for the poorer classes. And its origins, although it goes back to the second millennium, we know it appears in Italy in the 12th century, and it appears in Spain in the 11th century. Our next food, rice, has its origins in India, Assam, Thailand, China, and it made its way slowly west. And once there was enough water for irrigation, rice could be grown. And although rice wasn't new in the Mediterranean, the Romans knew it only medicinally, never as a food, and it wasn't widespread until really after Alexander the Great's expedition in the 4th century BC. And then with the Islamic revolution, it began to move west in the 7th century. It was being grown, we know, in Sicily in the 9th century and in Spain as well. Our next food is sugar. So although Roman writers know of sugar, they mention sugarcane, it's pretty clear that they have no first-hand knowledge of it. Small quantities were imported from further east in the pre-Islamic West, but pretty much it was the Arabs establishing sugarcane and sugar milling, especially in places like Palermo, which we know it was being cultivated in the 10th century. in Sicily and also in North Africa. And we know that once Sicily was captured by the Normans in the 11th century, the industry existed and then its fortunes began to fluctuate. Our next food is various citrus fruit. Now this is a little bit harder. Citrus trees such as bitter orange, which is known as the Seville orange, lemon, lime, shaddock, were all the principal ornamental plants in the Islamic world and not really grown for food. The fruits were eaten, but usually after sweetening. The bitter orange is called bitter for a reason. And they were used for syrup. Today, bitter orange is really only used for making marmalade and perfumes. And it's very difficult to find a bitter orange anywhere. The problem with citrus is that it's variable. It was a fact noted by Arab agronomists in the 10th century, and that's one of the difficulties in talking about it. Sicily is one of the prime locales of where orange might have had its beginning. And there's an Arab Sicilian poet of the 12th century who describes the oranges around Favara as being like, quote, balls on fire amongst emerald branches. The citron was mentioned by Roman authors in some medical treatises in the 1st or 2nd century, but probably not known later. There's some iconographical evidence of frescoes in Pompeii. But they're sort of isolated. There's no paleobotanical or literary evidence of these plants. I mentioned how the bitter orange at the time was known, and the sweet orange did not yet exist in the West. So the bitter orange was a pretty unique fruit, and its fruit, although bitter, was still precious because there were so few citrus fruits anyway. The lemon tree, the first mention of the lemon tree is from an Arab agronomist named Custos, who wrote a book called Book on Farming, where it's called the lemon tree, and he mentions it's very sensitive to cold. Tracing the lime tree is harder because the word limu, which is used to designate lime, is variable in Arabic, and we're not sure what they're talking about. The sweet orange is harder to determine. We know that it comes from China, but when and where it first appears is very difficult to figure out because most of the references to sweet orange are either inventions, a commentator's poor translation, or some sweet oranges, in fact, is a description of a sweet citron or a bitter orange that has been sweetened. So it's a little bit difficult to determine that. Banana and plantain, I mentioned before, they had been cultivated since antiquity. And in Egypt, they were being grown and brought across Africa to Spain. The Arabic word for banana, maus, still survives in Sicilian dialect as musa, so that we know there was one piece of evidence. Incidentally, just as a side note, there is a folkloric kind of cuisine in Sicily known as cucina arabo-sicula, which is an idea that Sicilians have of dishes that are influenced, not necessarily created by, but influenced by their Arab heritage. And it's purely folkloric. And dishes will be mentioned as, oh, this is Arab Sicilian. The watermelon came from the savanna of equatorial Africa and arrived in the Mediterranean about the same time as these other foods. And again, the way we trace it is kind of linguistic. So the term in classical Arabic is batik hindi, which simply means the melon of India. And another Arabic term, batik al-Sindhiya, means that it's from the Sindh, the area of northwest India. It moves across the Islamic world, and we have it now described in Sardinian dialect as Sandria, and in Castilian as Sandia, which is from the Arab, from the Sindh. And we also can follow its travels through North Africa by looking at what its name is in different places. So in Egypt, it's called Palestinian melon. In Valencia, it's called Algerian melon. And it's first mentioned in the anonymous calendar of Cordoba, which was written in 961 in Spain, and then perhaps anonymous work. Spinach is, this is a great vegetable. The famous Arab agronomist Ibn al-Awam, who lived in the 13th century, called it the queen of the vegetables. And westward diffusion came certainly from the Arabs. Its earliest reference is from the 10th century, and it appears in Spain in the 11th century. The artichoke is a great vegetable, and it most likely, you'll read in a lot of history books and a lot of food history that the Romans knew the artichoke, and I've got a long article about this in the journal Gastronomica, that it most certainly did not. It was likely developed based on DNA analyses, that it was a created vegetable, created from the cardoon, probably in the 10th or 11th century, and probably in Sicily. Only the cardoon was known by the Romans, and it's more or less impossible to trace its progress because Arabic terminology for both the cardoon and artichoke are completely confused. The one thing we do know is that in all European languages, the name for the artichoke derives from the Arabic. Eggplant was from Southwest Asia. It moves into the Mediterranean by the 10th century, we know. It's not appearing into cookbooks until much later, so we don't know what it's doing for a couple of centuries, but often these new plants were ornamentals. Now, hard wheat is the most important of these foods, and one of the reasons that hard wheat is so important is that one of the world's most famous products is made from it, namely macaroni, which is the generic term for all dried alimentary pastes made from Triticum turgidum variety durum, which is hard wheat, also known as semolina, and called pasta, macaroni, noodles. And the famous legend, of course, is that Marco Polo discovered macaroni in China, and he brought it back with him when he returned in 1297 to Venice. And I once gave this talk, a variation of this talk at a public library where the talk was titled, Macaroni, Its History as Slippery as a Wet Noodle. And it is. So, but before we get into depth about macaroni, we need to find out who invented it and why is that important. So if mixing flour and water together and stretching it into dough, if that's what's meant by pasta, that definition doesn't really tell us anything. It's not historically heuristic. The reason we're interested in the origin of macaroni is because it can contribute to a better understanding of how this new food played an important role in subsequent political and economic developments. So hard wheat, also known as semolina or durum wheat, is unique because of two features: its high gluten content and its low moisture content, which distinguishes it significantly from the wheat that was known by the ancient Greeks and Romans, namely Triticum aestivum, or summer wheat, known as soft wheat or bread wheat. And hard wheat is important because this consistency it has, it prevents the stretching and breaking when it's made into pasta during the curing and drying process. And it maintains its texture and its taste much better. And so when we get to the question is who invented it? Why is that important? Who invented it? Well, first, you need to remember that famine was a perennial occurrence in the Mediterranean, in the world, in fact. And during times of famine, food supply could be controlled because dried pasta had a very long shelf life. Second, governments and speculators could warehouse pasta for long periods of time to counteract years of low production and offset inflation that was caused by high prices and demand. And third, a plentiful supply of hard wheat, especially in the form of hardtack or ship's biscuit, but also in the form of macaroni, allowed longer sea voyages to occur, which essentially created the basis to feeding crews, opening up an age of exploration, namely transatlantic. So who invented macaroni? Marco Polo. Reason why we know he didn't find macaroni in China, he did, but he didn't find what we're talking about, is because in his diaries, and you'd think somebody would have noticed this, he used the words to describe what he found in China, not by the Chinese name, but he called it lasagna and vermicelli. And said, the Chinese have lasagna and vermicelli. How do you like that? So we know he knew of it. And in fact, macaroni was known in Italy, we know for sure, by the 12th century. It's been variously attributed to the Etruscans, to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the Chinese, but it's likely that it was an invention of the Arabs, and probably the Arabs in North Africa or Sicily. The earliest evidence that we have of macaroni that appears in written form is at this juncture of these three cultures, Sicilian, Italian, and Arab. And early recipes for vermicelli, for instance, such as the one in an anonymous 14th century Tuscan manuscript called the Libro della Cucina, is completely Arab influence. It's cooked in almond milk with sugar, saffron, and often rose water. Sicily is another early locus for the appearance of macaroni. And in Italian cookery works of the 14th century, pasta secca, that is dried pasta, macaroni, is called by the generic name of tria, which is derived from the Arabic word itria, which refers to vermicelli. So this was the word that was actually used by al-Idrisi, who was the Arab court geographer of the Norman king of Sicily, Roger II. He completed his book called the Book of Roger in 1154. This is 150 years before Marco Polo died. And in this 12th century Sicilian pasta, he mentions that it's produced in Trebia, outside of Palermo, and it's exported to Calabria. And by the mid-12th century, we have records of Sicilian pasta exports to Genoa. Spain is another locus for macaroni, and the famous geographer Al-Razi describes the hard wheat in Toledo as being a clear reference to hard wheat. Now, it's true that the Roman writer Varro also used the same description, but Varro's description is completely isolated, whereas Al-Razi's is repeated in multiple sources. So I've always found it kind of fascinating how surprised people seem when I mention that the Arabs had an influence on Italian cuisine. It almost seems unlikely. But why should it be so surprising? Take a stroll in Venice, in the architecture of which is so obviously Islamic influence, or inspiration at least, is proof enough that cultural influences are multivarious. And every school child knows where our Arabic numerals came from. But the other Arab contributions to field of learning is often unknown. And it's manifest in so many different ways in our language. You probably are familiar with examples coming from mathematics and astronomy, where Arabs gave us a wealth of terms such as algebra, algorithm, zenith, and zero. It's estimated that there's some 5,000 English words that are derived from the Arabic, including such unlikely words as mattress and jar. And in the two important areas for what I'm talking about, we're really looking at the influence in agriculture and hydrology, because they opened up this new agricultural season. So by the 13th century, there's a thriving intellectual movement. And keep in mind that Europeans didn't really know this influence was Islamic or Arab. There wasn't that kind of knowledge. But if we, as modern historians, can trace it, we can see it appearing linguistically in writings and what was being translated at the major translation centers of Toledo or Montpellier or in Palermo under the auspices of people like the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, or his son Manfred, who was responsible for a lot of translations. So the interesting thing is that at the time of the Norman court in the 12th century, and under Frederick II, who was Swabian, a lot of what's going on in the court kitchens is really influenced by Arab cookery at the time. Frederick admired Arab culture so much that Dante put him in the, I forget which level of hell, but he's there. And seventh level? Who's the Dante expert here? Lower. Well, whatever. That's we don't have to worry about that. And his admiration for Arab culture took form in a variety of ways. But some examples of both the Normans and Frederick II was the fact that the court physicians were Arab, mainly because the most advanced medical learning of the time was Arabic in nature. Court officials were Arab, the attendants, including eunuchs and a harem of Muslim women, the bodyguards were Arabs. The palace kitchen under Roger II, through his grandson William II, was under the supervision of a royal cook who was an Arab and known by the Arabic title Al-Nazir. He created these magnificent dishes for the court that were served on gold plates, and the servants were dressed in silk costumes. And we presume, we don't have any extant menus from these feasts, but we presume that they were dishes that probably include a lot of almond milk and rose water and sugar and spices such as saffron. So remember, though, in medieval times, when kings were routinely assassinated by poisoning food, the director of the royal kitchen was an extremely important court position. For the Normans and Swabians to have trusted their Arab citizens to this task was an indication of the place of the Arab Sicilian subjects. Of course, not so loved that they weren't eventually kicked out, but that's another story. So, to my mind, medieval Arab cookery kind of played a role in the development of European gastronomy, more or less identical to the role that Arab mathematics and astronomy played in the development of Western European sciences. Now I want to just delve a little bit deeper into the dietary books and the cookery books, because this is where things get kind of interesting. So I had mentioned that the elite in Europe are beginning to change their attitudes about eating and about the place of food, which actually has a place in Muslim theology, especially as represented by the depictions of the Garden of Delights. There's a sensual pleasure of eating as portrayed in the garden that intrigued Europeans, who began to associate luxurious food with the food of the Arabs. And it was a kind of Muslim sensuousness, which must have appeared attractive, counterpoint to how aesthetic the life was demanded of Christians at the time. And if you compare culinary texts, you can see some intimate connections between European and Arab cookery of the 14th century. The thing you have are some examples of recipes from cookbooks of that era, just comparing two separate recipes. And the best thing to do is just to read through them and see how fantastically similar they are. There was at least one Arabic cookbook that was translated into Latin in the 12th century, which is known as the Liber de Ferculis et Condimentis, the Book of Dishes and Seasonings, which was kind of a dietetic book, but it had a lot of recipes in it. And the Arab influence went far. There's an Anglo-Norman cookery work from 1320, which has recipes such as blanc de cerise, vert de cerise, anis cerise, which means respectively white food of Syria, green food of Syria, and yellow food of Syria. And these were, the first was a dish of capon boiled in almond milk with pomegranates, sugar, ginger, and white wine. The second is the same, but it's colored with parsley for the green. And the third is the same, but colored with saffron to make it yellow. And most of these recipes are heavily spiced with ginger, cinnamon, sugar, the use of almond milk, and the kind of technique known as endoring, which was the coloring of food, which is almost an alchemical notion of how food could be made to resemble gold, or yellow, because yellow is a source of gaiety in Arab culinary thought of the time. So you've got all of this obvious linguistic connections, and you have the use of these particular foods, rosewater, oranges, spices, abundance of sugar that was used for both cooking and sprinkled on afterwards, as we would sprinkle on salt. And a lot of these medieval recipes, in contrast to them, the Roman works, there's no appearance of sugar in the one important extant Roman work by Apicius from the 1st century. Coloring potential is never mentioned in Roman works. For the Arabs, coloring food was very important. And since dietetic was a wholly Arabic science at the time, it was, though, founded upon the earlier Greek works, which were then unknown in Europe. And one of the most important entrepôts for the translation of so many of these works was Palermo under Frederick II, as well as the University of Salerno, which he established, and where the most famous of the dietetic works by Ibn Butlan, translated as the Tecunum Sanitatis, which became the basis to European dietetic theory at the time. So a lot of these early food and dietetic manuals are either translated directly from the Arabic or heavily influenced by the Arabic manuscripts. And it's interesting, too, because it wasn't only in Palermo that this is happening, or Salerno, but also in Spain. Spain had important translation centers going on, especially in Toledo, as well as in France, in Montpellier. I'm just going to mention two other works. One is by Ibn al-Wafid. His work was translated as De Medicinis et Cibus Simplicibus. I don't actually speak Latin, so I hope that impressed you. Which was translated in the first half of the 12th century. And then Constantine the African was a Tunisian merchant and doctor who translated at the convent at Monte Cassino Arabic and Greek medical. His works were translated by a famous Jewish doctor named Ishaq ibn al-Israeli in the 10th century, in the early 10th century. And it was really to Constantine the African, who was the first great translator of Arabic to Latin books, by which the vast corpus of Arabic medical literature became available to the West. So, in conclusion, what I kind of want to focus on is this notion of a hierarchy of prestige and a world of culinary syncretism, which gives us a sense of how the Mediterranean is unified. Cultural transfer, as we know, takes time, and so does culinary transfer. So, did the 13th century recipe for fustakia, a chicken stewed in pistachios and sugar, which is found in the late 10th century Abbasid cookery work, Kitab al-Tabiq, become the Maraus Catalonicum of the Renaissance chefs Maestro Martino and Platina, a spit-roasted capon boiled with almonds, vinegar and juice-soaked breadcrumbs, cinnamon, ginger, and sugar? We don't know, but it sure seems that way, but it can't be traced. The French scholar of the Arab world, Maxime Rohatyn, pointed out in several written works that certain recipes of early Italian cookery adopted Arabic names, just outright adopted Arabic names. In the three cases that he uses, Romania, which appears in an Italian cookery work, which is from the Arabic Romania, meaning pomegranates, a dish made with pomegranates. There's Lomonia, which is a dish of meat and lemon juice, from the Arabic lemonia, lemon. The question is, how do these culinary fashions spread? It's true that there's written works, and these Arab culinary practices are being transmitted. We know the Crusaders are not responsible. A lot of it had to do in a much too, perhaps, overlooked areas. One, merchants. One of the most interesting things about the history of the Crusades is how money-hungry those Venetians were. They were supplying ships for the Crusaders to go to Palestine, and at the same time trading with the Muslims to make money. They didn't really care at all about what the Pope wanted. They were in it for the money. And they were spending time in the Middle East. And when a merchant goes, if any of you are merchants, I don't imagine you are, you have to eat when you're abroad. And what you eat is what's available, which is local food. And sometimes you fall in love with it, and you come home and you open up a gyro shop in New York City. And that's how it happens. So this Eastern style of food is clearly influencing the rulers of Europe, if not the general population. And we know there's this pervasive influence of medicine and dietetics. But this example of how intellectual influence and influences of practical aspects of life happen is really kind of interesting. I mean, take, for example, the Europeanization of Asiatic and African peoples, especially in the upper classes, which are usually the first to adopt the habits of the superior culture. Sometimes the superior state may be enamored with the elements of the other cultures because of an inferiority complex, and there's two great historical examples of that. The first is the Norman adoption of the elements of Arab culture in 12th century Sicily. And they were really kind of ruffians who descended upon and conquered this very sophisticated country of Arab Sicilians, also including a very large population of Greeks and Jews, all of whom, for the most part, were educated, which didn't exactly, and literate, which was what educated meant in those days. And they were wowed, yet they ruled this country, so they began adopting this superior culture. The other example is the 20th century American fascination with things French. In the United States, it's hard to believe, in the White House chef in the 50s and 60s was French. They weren't Americans. It's only recent that the White House chef has become American. And it's because we admired and thought French cuisine is superior to American cookery, which it was. So this sociological phenomenon is called by Maxime Rohatyn a hierarchy of prestige, where there's the tendency to copy the customs of the dominant culture. In the Latin West, in the medieval period, it was this attitude towards the Muslim world, which is a combination of both awe and fear. In a sense, it's still prevalent today, this kind of awe and fear of the Islamic world. And the Latin West had this, what they thought to be urgent desire to modernize, and they did it by culturally absorbing the learning of these peoples, so that by the end of the Middle Ages, the phenomenon of Arabic influence really played a serious role in the development of the sciences, and especially in dietetics, which is of interest to food. Now, there's a whole area which I've never really explored, and I would love to have somebody delve into this, but in the course of my research for Mediterranean Feast, one of the pieces of information that I would love to have explored further is this opaque history of the poor, which is everybody else. That's who we don't know about. And the poor and people who are cooking are basically women. And more importantly, let's look at Genoa between the 12th and 15th centuries. Here's something I didn't realize. The entire number of slaves in Genoa during this period of time has been numbered in 1458 as 2,059. 2,005 were Arab women, and they were cooks, and they worked in Genovese homes. How interesting it would be to see what the hell they were cooking, but we don't know. Maybe it exists in some archival document, but someone's got to go in there. So in the medieval world, where food plays this truly a world of culinary syncretism, where because of a world of commerce, people constantly interacting with each other and eating each other's food, cuisine becomes dynamic. It's a diachronic phenomenon which is complex to describe and to study because it's a moving target. The goalposts of culinary history are always moving. And that's what makes it fun to do, and it makes it a great entry into understanding a lot more than just food. It gives you an understanding, I think, of who we are, where we're going, and the importance of food on an economic, political, and physiological level. Anyway, thank you.